If you're a big fan of Tesla like myself, there's a big chance you've tried to buy this Teslaquila bottle. And just like anything else Tesla makes, it went fast. But hey, before you get ahead of yourself, let's actually rewind a little bit. Today I'm going to show you how to make your own replica Teslaquila bottle. That way you don't have to wait for Tesla to restock it. Just like I do in most designs, I started with graph paper. Starting here is just an easy way for me to double check my work and make sure that the proportions make sense. Once you've drawn out your shape, be sure to cut it out, and you're going to use it for reference later on. If you're messy like me, you can even tear it like I did, but this step is not necessary. I grabbed a wooden block and a 1x3 that was a couple of feet long. What I'm doing here is just outlining the lightning bolt, and this is where we're going to pour our epoxy. For the most part, I'm just approximating the length of each side, but if you want something more accurate, feel free to measure this. I would grab a fairly large size drill bit and create some holes on the top of each wooden block just for your screws to access the wood on the bottom a little bit more easily. And if you're having trouble visualizing this is what I mean. I tried using some drywall screws, but this wasn't really the best idea, so I ended up using Craig's pocket hole screws. I really like using pocket hole screws because the design of them essentially pulls the two wooden blocks together instead of just holding them in place the way that a drywall screw would. Keep in mind that this is not a perfectly sealed system. There are plenty of cracks between the wooden blocks, so we're going to seal them off with some hot glue. You probably guessed it, but we're just doing this so the epoxy doesn't pour out. And speaking of the epoxy, once we're done with the mold, we can actually start getting that set up. I'm using 2-part epoxy for this project, which means I need a measuring cup just to make sure that both parts are equal. We're going to be using most of the container, so that tiny nozzle just wasn't doing it for me. I decided to pour the whole thing in. Once I measured equal parts and I had this mixed up, we could start pouring the ink in. In this case, we're going to use a sunshine yellow shade, and that's because I did some research and I think this is going to be the closest match to the Teslaquila bottle. But don't take my word for it. We can actually reference the picture right now and tell me what you think. Do you think we nailed it? Now that we've gotten the epoxy's color as close to the Teslaquila bottle as possible, we can start pouring it in. Be sure to have your hot glue gun ready because you don't know if the epoxy is going to start pouring out of a crack that you may have missed, so it's good to have it on hand. One of the most common problems with epoxy is that it sometimes traps air bubbles, but you can get rid of these with heat. I brought out my heat gun and I noticed that the air bubbles started popping almost immediately. You can actually see them flickering on the screen as they pop. For those who don't have heat guns, you can also use a lighter to achieve the same results. Be very cautious when doing this because you might actually melt some of your hot glue, so take this in light passes and take your time. I gave the epoxy about 2 days to cure, and I even left it by a hot air vent just to speed up the process. Once the 2 days had passed, I tried to pry it apart after taking the screws out. I even used some pliers and I still struggled. It became very clear that this was not going to come off easily, so if I could give some advice, it would be to take a different approach. Try using a rubber molding if that's available to you. If not, try putting some tape over the wooden pieces. I'm sure that would be way easier to take off. I really struggled to take this off. I actually resorted to using a multi-tool and a hammer, but the hammer was way too aggressive and I actually ended up cracking my piece because of it. Of course, cracking my piece was not my intention at all, but it actually ended up being pretty convenient. And I say that because it forced me to copy the official bottle a little more closely, considering the design of the bottle's cap. Once I broke our piece free from the mold, I had to sand off all the remaining wood. It took a while, but it wasn't very difficult at all. I worked my way up through various grits, and by the end I was wet sanding with 1500 and then 2000 grit sandpaper. As you can see, the higher we go up in grit on the sandpaper, the smoother the final product will be. Towards the end, I used a polishing pad attachment on my drill to rub in some buffing compound. Once we were done with that, our pieces were pretty smooth. Not shiny just yet, just very smooth. We'll address the shiny portion later. For now, I just wanted to make use of the broken part and make it look like it was intended to be the bottle cap. I have a ton of magnets laying around, so I figured this would be a great way to join the two pieces. I aligned the body and the cap and then put a magnet on each end. That way the cap would be detachable. What you see me doing here is marking one end with a Sharpie, hoping that this stain passes over to the other side. That way I can drill into the exact same spot. The alignment was precise and the magnets work perfectly. Just be sure to add Gorilla Glue to each magnet so that they don't fall out of place. Next, I went to the table saw and grabbed a spare piece of walnut just to cut some thin strips for the legs. Using the thin strips, I started laying them out and seeing what would work best. I cut one of the longer strips in half and then glued the two small pieces to each side of the lightning bolt. The angles were a little bit weird, so this wasn't the ideal clamping situation, but it stuck in place, so that worked for me. Next, we had to remove any excess material off of the bottom of the lightning bolt, and we also had to establish a flat surface, and you'll see what I mean right here. Now, with the other remaining piece, we can make the legs. The biggest benefit here is that we established a flat bottom for the lightning bolt, so we can toy around with some angles that would fit that flat bottom. And it's not like I perfectly calculated what angle would work best. I more so just referenced the bottom on the lightning bolt and then cut it out as needed. I started by sketching a few lines onto each piece and just went with the flow. They weren't total shots in the dark because I knew that these were the angles I needed to recreate. I just didn't know what those angles were. I just drew lines as I went and removed a little bit of material at a time, and eventually we got to the right spot. Once I made sure that this angle would work, I ended up gluing all the pieces together, and wood glue is crazy strong, so this would be perfect. I wish I had a better clamping system, but holding them in place would have to do for now. I put our workpiece in front of a space heater just to speed up the process, and then once that was done, I sanded the wooden portion by hand. There was one final cut we had to make, but this portion would be easy. I just drew some reference lines on the bottom of each leg. This was done because the bottom of each leg was a different length, and evening them out would make the lightning bolt stand up vertically. Now that that's all done, we're going to clear coat the lightning bolt just to give it a glossy finish. And we don't want this glossy finish on the wooden base, so I'm covering this up with tape. I used Rust-Oleum's glossy clear coat, and this works great. I've used it in the past a few times. I gave it a few coats, and I waited half hour in between coats. Anytime you're using spray paint or any kind of clear coat, you want to give it a few light passes rather than holding it in the same place. As you can see, we're getting pretty close to the final product, but we're not done just yet. I want the wood and walnut portion to look great too. I just didn't want it to have a glossy finish, so I'm using Verithane's water-based polyurethane, and this is a satin finish. And while we're waiting for that to dry, please feel free to like and subscribe if you like what you're seeing so far. Once that's all done, we can finally wrap up the piece. And to do this, I'm going to use a Tesla decal, just to match the bottle. This can be cut out with a Cricut or purchased online, but after this, we should be good to go.